he stayed away from portraits. Yes. I don't think she felt
Live. We are live. We are live.
Was that one?
Oh, no, not that. That one's what's her name?
Okay, keep it down. Keep it down. Thank you. Welcome to the Cedarvulle Area Historical Society. We have a great crowd tonight. My name is Steve Myers. I am I'm the acting president of this gang here of great people. And I'm wearing. I just came straight from soccer practice from Lena. So 40 kids running around and kicking the ball. So I had to kind of rush over here to get here. So we are excited. We have a summer program, a trio, and this is our second of three. The one we had last month was Don Franz, who talked about the assassination of Lincoln. You can still see it. It's online. Go to our webpage on Facebook webpage or our YouTube page, and you can see it on there. And that's the same for this program tonight. If you're watching, great. If you can't finish it, that's great. You can come back, and if you're even in the audience, you can go, if you like it so much, and you can go back and watch it again as many times as you want. I would start at our home page, and if you get our newsletter, just kind of follow the instructions on how to get there. All right, so we are very excited tonight to welcome and introduce three talented ladies. They are from a group called the Women of Courage and Commitment. They're from Galena, Illinois, very historic town if you've been there. And so they are going to, the three of them, do a portrayal of Jane Addams, played by Deb Pausz, and Susan B. Anthony, portrayed by Cathy Elsbree, and then Miss Lee Adami is the moderator. So she's going to moderate. They're going to come up and speak, and very exciting. That I'm looking forward to it. So without further ado, we're not going to have an intermission, but at the end, we have lots of great food and fellowship in the kitchen area. So, welcome, ladies, and thank you. And I'm going to get to the streaming.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Women of Courage and Commitment Historical Plays. My name, as Steve told you, is Lee Adami, and I will be your narrator, MC, and referee, just in case any of you get rowdy. Our program this evening features two women that fought their whole lives to advance women's rights and equality. Our first woman of courage will be Susan B. Anthony, and she will be followed by your very own Jane Addams. So sit back, get comfortable, switch off your cell phones, and enjoy the show. Susan B. Anthony was born on February the 15th, 1820, in Addams, Massachusetts. Her father was Daniel Anthony. He was a wealthy mill owner, a Quaker, abolitionist, and temperance leader. His wife Lucy was not a Quaker, but she was a Methodist, for which he was rebuked by his church. In fact, after hosting a dance class at his house, the church disowned him altogether. Susan was the second eldest of 7 and was raised a Quaker. She learned to read at 3. Her father, believing both his sons and his daughters should be equally educated. At 17, he pulled her out of the local school and sent her to a Quaker boarding school. She hated it. She managed only 1 semester before leaving. During the Panic of 1837, her family lost everything. So Susan left home to work as a teacher and help support the household. During her life, Susan B. Anthony's experience with the Teachers' Union, temperance and anti-slavery reforms, along with her Quaker upbringing, laid fertile ground for a career in the reforms of women's rights. Please welcome Susan B. Anthony.
wonderful to be behind a podium again. This is rather different than the receptions I received 50 years ago. Then they threw things at me, and they weren't roses. I always dress in black. Tomato juice doesn't stain. As a Quaker, I was raised to believe that women had the right to speak in public. They spoke at church meetings all the time, and that belief has caused me a great deal of trouble my whole life. In a speech I once gave, I said, "No advanced step taken by women has been so bitterly contested as that of speaking in public. For nothing which I have attempted, not even to secure suffrage, have I been so abused, condemned, and antagonized. So thank you for allowing me to speak this evening." I taught for 8 years, and I was the headmistress of a school for 2, and I sought educational reform the whole time I was in the system. My first foray into public speaking was at a New York State Teachers Convention in 1853. It was a large room, and there were 200 men sitting in the front, teachers, and 400 women sitting in the back. The men in the front were, of course, leading the meeting, and they were spending all of their time complaining about their lack of pay and lack of respect. Now, mind you, those men were earning $10 a month for their teaching, and the women in the back were earning $2.50. I got tired of listening to them whine, and I stood up and raised my hand. The whole room fell silent momentarily. And then the men in the front spent a half an hour yelling and debating with each other whether it was proper to allow a woman to speak. Finally, they called on me. I stood and said, "Do you not see that as long as society says a woman is incompetent to be a lawyer, minister, or doctor, but has ample ability to be a teacher, that every man of you who chooses this profession tacitly acknowledges that you have no more brains than a woman?" It was not too well received. In 1857, I presented a resolution calling for colored children to be educated at public schools from the beginning through college, like every other child. Well, I was told that was not even a proper topic for discussion. In 1859, I presented another resolution. This called for males and females to be educated together in public schools, beginning at the beginning and going all the way through college. This was fiercely opposed and decisively rejected. One opponent said, and I quote, "This would be a vast social evil, the first step in school which seeks to abolish marriage, and behind this picture I see a monster of social deformity." I received no awards for that speech either. And this part is part of the speech I made that did not sit well with any audience. If all the rich and all the church people should send their children to public schools, they would feel bound to concentrate their money on improving these schools until they met the highest standards. It was also not well received.
Throughout her life, she fought for equal pay for equal work. She wrote, and I quote, "I do not demand equal pay for any woman, save those who do equal work in value. Scorn to be coddled by your employers. Make them understand that you are in their service as workers, not women."
That was also not well received. Thus, my efforts at educational reform fell far short.
Temperance was very much a women's issue at this time because of the laws giving husbands complete control of the family and its finances. A woman with a drunken husband had little legal resource, even if his alcohol consumption led to abuse and left the family destitute. If the woman attained a divorce, which was very difficult to do, he could easily end up with the sole guardianship of the children. Miss Anthony, you began your social justice career as a temperance leader, and I wondered if you could share some of your experiences.
Since I could effect no change in education, I sought another outlet for zeal in my reform. I joined the Daughters of Temperance, a group working on strengthening liquor laws. In 1849, I was elected president of the Rochester chapter, and I worked very hard. And 4 years later, I had the honor of being invited to speak at the Sons of Temperance convention. I was given a seat on the stage. I rose to speak and was rudely told to sit down. A woman's place was to listen and learn, not to contribute. Well, I was so angry, I stormed off the stage. I went directly to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house, and together we formed the Women's State Temperance Society. We set about to collect 28,000 signatures to stop the sale of alcohol in New York State. When I presented these, I was so proud. When I presented these to the state legislature, they laughed at me and they said, "Look, these don't count. These are women's signatures." At that moment, it dawned on me that we would make no change until we had the right to vote. Otherwise, we were just dogs baying at the moon. But my interest in women's rights and temperance had to be set aside because the issue of slavery took over all other social reform.
In 1837, age 16, Anthony had already collected petitions against slavery in opposition to the gag rule, which forbade anti-slavery petitions to be given to Congress. In 1851, she organized an anti-slavery convention in Rochester. She was also part of the Underground Railroad. An entry in her diary read, "Fitted out a fugitive slave for Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman." She developed a reputation for fearlessness in facing down attempts to disrupt her meetings. But, unfortunately, opposition became overwhelming on the eve of the Civil War.
My family bought a farm outside of Rochester, New York, and it became the hotbed for abolitionist activity. Frederick Douglass was a frequent visitor of a Sunday afternoon, and he and I became close personal friends. He asked me to join him on the abolition circuit. We traveled everywhere giving speeches. Let me share a newspaper article with you written in 1861 about some of those meetings. Mob action shut down meetings in New York State from Buffalo to Albany. Rotten eggs have been thrown, benches broken, and knives and pistols have gleamed in every direction. In Rochester, the police were called to escort Miss Anthony and other speakers from the building for their own safety. My radical beliefs were part of the problem. I believed in a vision of a racial, integrated society, much like the Scotch and the Irish and the German had when they immigrated. And that was radical for a time when abolitionists were still trying to figure out what to do with slaves, and people like Abraham Lincoln were calling for African Americans to be shipped to newly established colonies in Africa.
Anthony formed the Women's Loyal League with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they collected 400,000 14th Amendment signatures, assuming that the amendment would include women as citizens. They were extremely upset when told by Frederick Douglass that it was the Negro's time and that women could wait. This caused a falling out with Douglass. but the friendship was eventually re-established.
I always supported my African American brothers and sisters, but I was angered because women always took the back seat. Men, once again, were the rulers. This time, the only difference was they were colored men.
The women's rights movement was gaining momentum, and Stanton had organized the first local event, the Seneca Falls Convention, in 1848. In 1852, Anthony attended her first National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse, New York, where she served as one of the secretaries. She came away from the event thoroughly convinced that the rights which women needed above all other was the right of suffrage.
My father, mother, and sister all attended the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. They signed the Declaration of Sentiments. When they returned home, they brought me all the material and they were very excited. I read it and said, these demands are outrageous. I don't want the right to vote. I just want women to get equal pay. I have certainly progressed since then, haven't I? An example of the frequent humiliation that women faced was when I led a campaign to improve property rights for married women because they had none. I took a lecture and petition campaign to every county in New York in a bitter winter of 1855, even though the snow made it difficult to travel by horse and buggy. When I presented 10,000 signed petitions to the New York State Judiciary Committee, the men actually had the nerve to tell me that they were the oppressed sex because they had to do things like let ladies have the best seats in the carriage. The committee report noted, there are cases in which these petitions have been signed by both husband and wife. Standard procedure prescribes men should sign for both. Because of this error in judgment, we recommend that these petitioners seek a law authorizing that the men in such a marriage wear petticoats and the women wear trousers. Do you hear any petty sarcasm from the Judiciary Committee of New York State? I would like to share an anecdote that I think sums up the position of women at that time. I was in Albany on Christmas Eve working on an abolition speech, and there came a knocking at my door. When I went, I discovered a woman, heavily veiled, standing with a young girl. I invited them in. She was the former headmistress of a school. Her brother was a United States senator. Her husband was a well-known doctor and an assemblyman in New York State. She had caught him in an indiscretion, and she did what no wife was supposed to do. She confronted him. He threw her downstairs. She stood up and said that she was going to call the police, and he did what most or many husbands who had a wife they couldn't control or who didn't do what they demanded, he had her put in a mental institution. She was there 18 months, not allowed a visit from children or family. Finally, her brother got her released, and she was allowed a very brief meeting with her 2 sons and her daughter. When she complained to her brother about how brief the meeting had been, he said to her, well, you know your husband by law owns the children. Just submit. So she kidnapped her daughter and arrived on my doorstep. I hid them as well as I could, covering them with disguises, and we got on a train and we went to New York City. We arrived about 10 o'clock Christmas night on a very snowy evening, and we trudged from one hotel to another, trying to rent a room. Now, the rooms were available, And we had money, but what we didn't have was a man accompanying us. No one would give us a room. Exhausted, we finally came to a tawdry hotel, and I was done. I said, I will stand here until you give us a room. And the clerk said, I'll call the police. And I said, and I will stand here till the police come and put me in jail. Well, he let us have a room, and it was terrible. The water froze overnight in the pitcher by the bedside. I took the mother and child to a friend of mine on the Underground Railroad, knowing that she would be able to protect them. When I arrived back in Albany, the doctor had already found out what I had done, and he demanded that I tell him where the mother and child were. Well, I refused, and my abolitionist friends were very angry. They were afraid I would hurt their cause. And I said to them, trust me, as I ignore all laws for a slave, I will ignore all laws for an enslaved woman. You would die to save a slave's life. I will die to save this woman and her child. Unfortunately, he found the mother and child, and she never saw her daughter again.
Anthony traveled all over the country, speaking at more than 100 lectures per year. She braved storms, blizzards, heat waves, and traveled by train, wagon, boat, and sleigh. She spoke wherever she could, abandoned Civil War barracks, churches, saloons, and once from the top of a lumber wagon. In most of the events, she was the only female in the room.
I spent years faced with tomatoes and rotten eggs, and I was dragged through the streets in effigy, and my effigy was burned. I slept in dirty hotels and plucked bed bugs from my bonnet and missed a good cup of coffee more than anything. I wrote to my family, oh, the crimes committed in the kitchens in this land. I can assure you that my avoirdupois, fat, has been rapidly reduced. But sometimes the response was surprising and heartwarming. I was in Leadville, Colorado, and the only place large enough for me to speak was a saloon. And the owner, knowing my temperance leanings, had very graciously covered all the bottles behind the bar with yards of calico. I stood on the bar and spoke to an overflowing room of lead miners. They were even standing out on the sidewalk. Each and every one of them was smoking a cigar, a pipe, or a cigarette, and they were all drinking. I started my speech and I had a coughing fit. And the men very courteously put out all of their smokes. They kept drinking, but they put out all of their smokes, and when I was done, I was warmly applauded, and they passed the hat. And when it came back to me, it was full of gold dust and gold nuggets, which was really appreciated because I lived on what I made on those lectures. I also went 36 years in a row to Washington to speak to Congress, to give my plea for suffrage. My last trip was in my 86th year. A Washington newspaper said, "We have witnessed a spot of red in Washington. It is a harbinger of spring." No, it is not Robin Redbreast. It is Susan B. Anthony in a red shawl come once again to harangue Congress to let women vote. I've rambled too long. I believe you have specific questions to ask me about my voting.
I do. Could you comment on the quote from President Andrew Jackson that said, "Giving women the right to vote would make every home on earth a living hell"?
The oligarch of sex, which makes every husband, brother, father, son, oligarch over every mother, daughter, sister, wife, which ordains all men sovereign and all women their subjects, this is the head that lives at home. This is the lie that fosters dissension, discord, and rebellion.
I see in my research that even your brother-in-law said he'd rather have one of your cream biscuits than to hear you had won the vote.
I assure you, ma'am, I can both bake a biscuit and fill out a ballot. And I'll bet every woman in this room can do the same, yes?
I'm sure they can. I understand then that you voted in the 1872 election,
Yes, I did.
and that subsequently led to your arrest.
Yes, it did. I was taken into custody by a deputy United States Marshal and taken directly to jail via a streetcar.
Streetcar?
A streetcar. Oh, and I did not have the fare. I told the conductor, I am traveling at the expense of the United States government. My escort here will gladly pay my fare. I thought it good the women on board witnessed my arrest, because the fact is, we women are in chains and we do not realize it.
You had no doubt that you should have voted?
Not a party. One question remains. Are personal freedom and personal representation inherent rights and privileges, or are they things to be given and taken by a ruling class? If the former, this is indeed a free country. But if the latter, this is a despotism, and we women are its victims.
I understand that you were fined for breaking the law. Did you ever pay it?
Absolutely not. I will not pay $1 of that unjust penalty. What I will do is quote for you an old revolutionary maxim. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God.
I believe your newspaper was called The Revolution. I heard that Harriet Beecher Stowe suggested that you might get more support if you renamed the paper something else, something a little less militant.
Oh, yes. I suppose we could call it the Rosebud. That would suit all of those who come in white kid gloves with perfume behind their ears to scatter rosebuds on our monuments. The very monuments that guarantee women the right to their own earnings, the right to their own inheritance, and the right to their own property. And yes, the right to their own children, which until recently was a right of fathers only. These rights were won with blood and sweat. There can be no other name than the Revolution.
Well, let me go back just a little bit. When did you first realize the extent to which women's rights needed reform?
When I was but a girl in school, my teacher refused to teach me long division, saying it was a calculation unnecessary for a girl to learn. It is ridiculous to speak of male and female sunshine or male and female rain. It's even more ridiculous in relation to the mind, to thought, to the soul, where there's undeniably no such thing as sex. To speak of male and female education and male and female schools? Oh.
So it was this realization while you were that young that gave rise to your adult beliefs and activism?
It was we the people. Not we the white male citizen, but we the whole people that formed this union. And we did not form this union to give the blessings of freedom, but to keep them.
With all due respect, Miss Anthony, did you find it really hard? I mean, it was an arduous task that you imposed upon yourself. Years of traveling and no rest.
Is there a reason you're asking me about not resting? Oh, actually, the older I get, the more I'm able to help the world. I'm rather like a snowball. The farther you roll me, the more I gain.
Did you think that after all the work you and many others had done, that it would take so long to get the right to vote?
Little did we think when we began this contest that 50 years later, we would have to leave the battle unfinished. But our hearts are filled with joy to know the next generation will take on this fight, finally, with college educations, business experience, and the right to speak freely in public. But we must never give up. The battle is not yet won. Oh, one day we will have the right to vote. We will have equality. And when we do, they will look back on those of us who came before, and they will know that we demanded men their rights and nothing more. Women their rights and nothing less.
Thank you, Mr.
Not used to curtsying. Susan didn't, I don't think.
And now we get to Jane Addams, your very own Jane Addams. My job is to give the nuts and bolts of this history of a really remarkable woman. She was born and raised here in Cedarvulle. She's been called many things: a socialist reformer, pacifist, saint, at times the most honored, recognized, and revered woman in America. Yet at other times, she was called the evil spider at the center of a web of un-American and anti-Christian scoundrels. A deeply influential sociologist, throughout her life, Jane remained a true Victorian lady. The range of Jane Addams' social and political concerns is nothing short of astonishing. What follows is a partial list of organizations to which Jane belonged, was president of, or founded. You may recognize some of them. The National Council of Women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the American Civil Liberties Union, the World Peace Foundation and American Peace Society, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Federation of Labor, the National Women's Trade Union League, the YWCA, and the Women's National Committee of the Socialist Party. The list of accomplishments goes on and on, but today we want to take you right back to the beginning, right here in the rural area of Cedarvulle. In 1860, Jane Addams was welcomed into the world by her father, the great John Addams, abolitionist, suffrage supporter, and friend of Abraham Lincoln. Her mother, Sarah, gave birth to 9 children, of whom only 4 survived to adulthood. Sarah was known throughout the town for her good works, but unfortunately died before Jane reached the age of 2½. Jane's elder sister, Mary, at age 17, took over the raising of Jane, or Jenny, as she was called by her family. Please welcome Jane Addams.
Oh, good evening. It's such a pleasure to be back here at the town of my birth. Oh, as a child, I loved roaming this beautiful countryside, and I loved our house, which was the largest house in the town. And I went to a one-room schoolhouse where the children of the miners and farmers and laborers were my equals and my friends. Oh, and I enjoyed doing so many things. I believe my upbringing here really affected what I thought of the world and helped shape the rest of my life. Well, as you heard, my mother died when I was just 2. She was pregnant at the time, and she was helping another Cedarvulle woman deliver her baby. Well, the fall caused my mother to go into labor. The baby died, and sadly, so did my mother just a week later. I have no real memory of this, but it's left a very strong moral lesson for me. I believe my mother gave her life helping another.
Jane's father was a remarkable man, and she worshipped the ground that he walked on. He guided her early reading and encouraged her belief in the basic goodness and redeemability of human nature. Being the most important influence on her life, she was always looking for his approval. She said she was considered a little spoilt, willful, and at times extremely stubborn. But she wanted to emulate him and his life's accomplishments.
My father's political beliefs were founded right here in Illinois, and he helped establish the Republican Party along with Congressman Washburn. My father was also a staunch abolitionist, and I would find out later as an adult that he had actually been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping many slaves escape to Canada. My father was a successful entrepreneur and bank president, and he also served on the Illinois Assembly. He was a close friend and supported the candidacies of President Lincoln and later President Grant. My father believed in the basic goodness of human nature, and he believed that classes should be able to live, work, and interact together. I made it a goal to read every single book in the Cedarvulle library, partially to impress my father. And oh, how I enjoyed the novels of Charles Dickens and how his characters affected what I thought of the plight of the poor and social classes.
When young, Jane was worried about her appearance.
Oh, I was an ugly pigeon-toed little girl, and I was obliged to walk with my head very much to one side. I was always concerned lest I embarrass my handsome father.
Jane had a crooked back. When she was 8, John Addams married again. His second wife, Anna Haldeman, was 5 years his senior. She was a widow with 2 sons. She aspired to be cultured, civilized, and proper. Her oldest son married Jane's older sister, Alice, and he became a brilliant surgeon who was to operate on Jane's back later on. Her other son, George, became Jane's best friend, and they became inseparable, encouraging each other in their intellectual and social growth.
George was my dearest friend and quite brilliant. We had much joy in visiting my father's flour mill. And George had a keen interest in biology. And as we roamed this beautiful countryside, I began to appreciate George's passion for nature, which ignited in me a scientific interest and caused me to think about medicine as my first career. Oh, I had great affection for him until we were both sent to separate schools. I'd like to read something that I wrote back in my youth about our adventures. The prairie around the village was broken into hills, one of them crowned by a pine wood, grown up from seeds sown by my own father in 1844, the very year that he came to Illinois, a testimony to the fact that even the most vigorous pioneers gave at least an occasional thought to beauty. The banks of the mill stream rose into high bluffs, too perpendicular to be climbed without skill, and containing caves, some of which were so black they could not be explored without the use of a candle. Oh, my stepbrother and I carried on games and crusades which lasted week after week, and sometimes even summer after summer, as only free-spirited country children could do.
At the age of 16, Jane was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed only 95 pounds. And she was still unsatisfied with her appearance, to say the least.
My nose is a lump of flesh, utterly lacking in character. I am cursed with 8 horrible freckles. My hair is perfectly straight. I'm pigeon-toed, and I cannot dance.
She was actually considered to be quite pretty with dark eyes, but the curvature in her spine caused her much awkwardness and self-doubt. When Jane turned 17 in 1877, her father insisted she attend the Rockford Female Seminary, encouraging her goal to become a doctor.
It was there that I was introduced to the works and writings of contemporary philosophers, sociologists, scientists, civil workers, and educators. And I got to meet many of these people later on in my life, and I got to work with them as well. I myself authored over a dozen books and some 500 articles.
In the 1870s, there was great controversy over higher education for women, conflicts over the nature and proper role of women. A Harvard medical professor argued that higher education damaged the reproductive systems of women and led to nervous prostration. Too much stimulation to the brain drew blood from the uterus and caused it to atrophy.
Ridiculous! The educability and the intelligence of women has been denigrated by men throughout history. And in this last quarter of the 19th century, pushed by a distrust of an immigration surge from Southern and Eastern Europe, our religious leaders have claimed that it's a woman's right to save the race by having white, native-born, and Protestant babies. It's a woman's duty to stay home and to stay healthy. Absolute nonsense.
While there at Rutgers Seminary, Addams enjoyed a small, intense group of intellectually demanding friends, and they set up a cultural reading program for themselves, including the works of Charles Darwin, John Ruskin, and Edward Gibbon.
And we also read the notorious Thomas de Quinc's report on his drug-taking activities. So one morning in our room, to capture his transcendental insights, we took opium. I did not experience enlightenment, only sickness and disorientation. This is not a path I will continue on.
Schooling and distance changed the friendship between Jane and George. She found comfort in her school female friendships, and she could not imagine a relationship with any man.
I was a great admirer of platonic love, or sacred and pure friendship. And I also think that's so much higher than what is normally considered with the word love. But George did miss me, and he actually wanted to marry me. And of course, our stepmother was always trying to match us. But George so resented my newfound political and social ideals that I thought it best that we remain brother and sister. My stepmother was furious. I had rejected her son. This also caused bad feelings among the family as well. And I'm sad to say that later on, George studied so hard doing biological research at Johns Hopkins that he suffered a nervous breakdown. I don't think he ever fully recovered. He later became a recluse and died at the age of 48.
Jane would return to Cedarvulle on weekends until she graduated from the Rockford Seminary in June of 1881. She was the valedictorian and president of her class, a year later accepting her BA degree. She spent the first free summer visiting friends here in Cedarvulle and Mount Carroll. But then in August, on a trip to Green Bay, without warning, her father was taken ill. Believed to be a ruptured appendix, he died the next day, just before her 21st birthday. Without her father, the house in Cedarvulle no longer held any joy for her.
I was devastated when my father died. That fall, I did attend a medical school in Philadelphia, but due to worsening back problems and grief over my father's death, I did not succeed. I returned here to Cedarvulle, demoralized, depressed, and adrift. My stepmother, I did actually then consent to a back surgery, and my brother-in-law, Harry Halderman, did operate on my back. And that was in 1885, I'm sorry, 82. And that left me wearing a whalebone, leather, and steel brace thereafter. My stepmother suggested that we go to Europe to help me recover, to deal with my father's grief, and to find some purpose for my life.
Upon return in 1885, after only briefly staying here in Cedarvulle, they traveled to Baltimore to visit George at the Hopkins University. From then on, winters were spent on the East Coast with George, and they returned to Cedarvulle only during the summers of 1885 and 86. In late 87, Jane left for Europe again, this time traveling with her best friend Ellen Gates Starr, whom she met during her Rockford College days.
Ellen was my dearest friend, and when we visited Oxford, we became fascinated with the Arnold Toynbee legacy, the settlement house movement. These were houses built in poor urban areas where volunteers, middle-class volunteers, shared their culture and knowledge with their low-income neighbors. It was hoped that with childcare, health care, and education, poverty could also be eliminated. This is where my dream really started to solidify. A vision of a big house down among the little houses.
Jane had finally made up her mind what she wanted to do, and so returned home to begin her preparations. She studied bookkeeping and corresponded with other fledgling settlements in New York City. She set her affairs in order, took what remained of her father's legacy, and said goodbye to her home and Cedarvulle. Jane and Ellen went to Chicago and started looking for the big house of her vision. They tramped around Chicago for 5 months before they saw the old mansion built 30 years before by Charles J. Hull, number 335 South Halsted Street. It stood surrounded by dirty, ramshackle buildings, teeming with the poorest of the poor. Jane had found her dream.
I used my considerable inheritance to buy this run-down abandoned mansion in a crowded, poverty-stricken region of Chicago, where 19 different nationalities lived among the 50,000 residents. The streets were filthy, the schools inadequate, children and women working in unregulated, dangerous sweatshops for egregiously low wages and in deplorable conditions. Well, despite these daunting challenges, we created a community of women called residents, and they began to teach classes in art, history, and literature. They also taught the domestic skills of cooking and sewing. Within the first year, donations began to pour in, and soon Hull House had kindergarten classes, a day nursery, a boys and girls club, a gymnasium, a playground, a cooperative boarding school, a music school, an art gallery, a theater with drama workshops, plus classes in literacy and languages.
Halsted Street ran 32 miles across Chicago, with Polk Street crossing it around midpoint in the 19th ward. There were 255 saloons in the area, 8 of which were Hull House neighbors. There were 7 churches, of which only 3 held services in English. Jane planned to be the bread givers, believing in labor alone is happiness, and that the only true and honorable life is one filled with good works and honest toil. All were welcome, and just like in Cedarvulle, their door was always open. The intertwined image of bread as profound nurturance and women as the generous custodian of life would run consistently through the Addams writing for the rest of her life. She wrote a poem which became the Hull House's anthem.
Of cities that shall be, within whose streets its citizen shall live life worthily. Its doors are open wide, to all who come it bids good cheer, and to some it says abide. Even through life's hardest storm, the shelter we together build, all that keeps us warm, that fellowship is heaven sent, that it alone can free the human heart from bitterness and give it liberty.
Jane considered her life to be a pilgrim's progress. Buildings were added to Hull House in quick succession. They also added a coffee house, reading groups, a handicraft centre, 5 bathing rooms, and eventually a Labour museum.
And the first statement of purpose for our Hull House Charter reads, to provide a center for higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions in the industrial districts of Chicago.
Unfortunately, the stench, the vermin, the piles of garbage, and the corruption of the collectors was horrific. And so, of course, Jane felt she had to step in and work to clean up the streets.
I came to realize that if I was going to clean up those filthy streets and rid Chicago of its dirty political machine, I would have to deal with the political powers that be. So, in 1895, I was elected the garbage inspector for the 19th Ward, my first foray into political life. And I made those city councilmen realize that garbage collection, not always high on their agendas, was actually a key to a more beautiful, healthier, and livable city for all citizens. But oh, how much more we could have done if we had had the right to vote.
Hull House was a place for enthusiasms. It helped give form to social life. It offered the warm welcome of an inn, but above all, it was a place that Ellen and Jane aimed to make as beautiful as they could. It was the function of the settlement to bring into the circle of knowledge and fuller life men and women who would otherwise be left outside. They were accepting only women at first, but started taking male residents in 1891. But women remained in the central positions, where women reformers could operate without the dominance of male associations. There was much labor unrest in the 1890s. Union repression by owners, strikes and violent reprisals often carried out by state and federal government. Jane was often asked to help with arbitration. In 1894, Jane was asked to help with the Pullman strike, and she found this heartbreaking. After 5 consecutive pay cuts inflicted on its workers, she tried to arbitrate while finding herself on the side of the workers, and she was horrified at the violence that broke out.
I tried to find solutions that both management and workers could live with, but not always successfully. And one of my central goals was to eliminate child labor. The officers of the Juvenile Protection Agency at Hull House would frequently accompany me on my missions to raid the nut-shelling factories that exploited our younger children.
At this time, Hull House was joined by a wealthy, educated young woman called Mary Smith. She donated much of her wealth to support Jane's causes, and they became inseparable. They traveled together, they took vacations together, and Jane spent much time with Mary's family, eventually staying with the Smiths whenever she was in Chicago, rather than at the hectic Hull House. In 1896, Jane traveled to England and Russia, where she met Leo Tolstoy.
A great genius, making intellectual contributions beyond price with his writings. A man who had the ability to lift the level of his conscience, his own life to that level. He introduced me to the concept of pacifism.
In 1898, Jane joined the Anti-Imperialistic League.
The Spanish-American War caused me to spend more time on world peace. War has been a great setback to the development and growth of our civilization. And as I watched the children playing war games in the streets and killing the Spaniards, it made me realize that the children's attitude reflects a dangerous shift in the attitude of American society as a whole. We must not glorify brutality. The same courage and readiness to meet death can be displayed without the accomplishment of killing our fellow man.
Jane served on the Chicago School Board from 1905 to 1909.
Oh, the importance of a good education is paramount to society.
In 1906, she was invited to address the annual convention of National American Women's Suffrage Association.
And my speech was entitled, "The Modern City and the Municipal Franchise for Women." I shared how critical it was for women to be able to vote if we were going to ever clean up a corrupt political machine, plus our streets and water. And I urged my audience to take up what I called civic housekeeping. And one of the members of my audience at that time was Susan B. Anthony. She was 86, and she was attending her 38th convention. I also had the opportunity to meet the president of the National, Carrie Chapman Catt. And I convinced Mrs. Catt that the next convention should be held in Chicago. And my goal was to have those mostly white and upper and middle class delegates drink from the well of human experience. Well, my goal was realized in 1907 when the convention was held in Chicago, and our Hull House residents gave a symposium on a juvenile court system, one that we had pioneered, the work being done to eliminate infant mortality, and our efforts to improve conditions in the sweatshops.
From 1907, she traveled all over the United States and the world, giving speeches, some of which were paid, with most of the proceeds going to Hull House.
There was always a need for fundraising, and that took a large part of my time.
In 1909, the Chicago Tribune published an editorial in support of racially segregating the city's schools.
I was contacted by Ida B. Wells, the influential African-American writer and suffragette who had exposed the world to the injustice of lynching. And she asked me if I could use my influence to help stop this plan. Well, I said yes, and we did. For the next few years, I worked with thousands of women who gave speeches, organized state agendas, marched, and lobbied Congress and politicians on both sides of the aisle to support a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution.
In 1915, Jane attended the first women of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at The Hague, which then became the most important league for her, and which she supported to the end of her life. In 1917, Addams maintained her pacifist position after the US entry into the First World War.
My stance on the war caused my popularity to fall. I was no longer considered America's first woman. I was attacked in the newspapers, and I was no longer asked to give speeches.
But Jane continued her suffrage work without ceasing.
Finally, on May 21st, 1919, an Illinois Congressman, James Mann, cut from the same radical political mold as my father and Senator Washburn, proposed a resolution to approve a women's suffrage amendment, the 19th, and this is how it reads. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any other state on account of sex. By a vote of 304 to 89, the House passed it. Then the Senate, 15 days later, passed it with a vote of 56 to 25. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan on June 10th were the first states to ratify it. By August of 1920, we needed just one more state to get to 36, the number needed that would approve an amendment to give women the basic right of democracy, the vote. Most of the southern states had already voted no. If we could not get one more state in the South, all would be lost and the fight would be left to the next generation. It all came down to one dramatic and fateful week 101 years ago in Tennessee. Pro-suffragettes, known as SUFs, sported yellow roses, and the anti sported red. Harry Byrd, the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, had been wearing a red rose and had initially voted against the suffs. But in the end, he cast the one vote needed for Tennessee to become the all-important 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And this is what Mr. Byrne had to say. I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. After the success of this, the National took on a new name, the League of Women Voters.
After the collapse of the stock market on October the 29th, 1929, Jane was gradually forgiven her pacifism and her lack of true patriotism, and she began appearing once more on the lists of the most famous, most influential, and most recognized women. When Good Housekeeping magazine named her first on its 12 greatest living women, Addams said,
"One of the committee formally regarded me as a traitor, and two of the others hadn't even heard of me until this contest."
Jane was invited to speak and received honors from colleges and universities that had once shunned her. She was eloquent on the topic of ethics as a lived process of cooperation and, above all, mutuality.
May I warn you against doing good to people and trying to make people good by law. One does good, if at all, with people and not to people. Democracy is not necessarily an attainment, but more of a process.
In 1931, Jane was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, finally receiving official recognition for her tireless efforts on behalf of peace. She was only the second woman to be awarded the prize.
I could not attend. I was in the hospital awaiting lung surgery. And when the prize was announced, letters and cables came in from all over the world. We don't expect to be able to change human nature, we people of peace, but we do hope to change human behavior. And this is a process that can only occur through a careful path of education. And it's not necessarily an inspiring role, and it tests our endurance and our moral enterprise, but we must keep doing it.
She was elated with her win and promptly donated her share of the prize money, $16,418, to the WILPF. She asked for no publicity because she was wary of giving a false impression of prosperity and financial security. The same year, her income of $10,000, she simply gave away to the unemployed around Hull House. She was flooded with desperate letters from around the entire country begging for help. The Great Depression of 1929 was still causing Jane great concern. There was an increasing unemployment amongst her Chicago neighbors. In 1932, more than 12 million people were unemployed, which was 25% of the nation's workforce.
I have watched with fear as the people in my community, men and women, saw their small margin of savings disappearing, and heads of households anticipating not being able to feed their children in the future. The cold clutch of fear is one of the most hideous aspects, I think, of human nature.
Roosevelt then won the election, pledging to bring the country out of the Depression. Jane joined forces with his New Deal and worked towards the appointment of Frances Perkins, a former Hull House volunteer, as Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman cabinet member in American history.
During the early 1930s, I watched the rise of fascism and repression in Europe with despair. In 1932, we concentrated our efforts on fighting the banks and the munition industries, resulting in the Nye Committee being formed, which revealed shockingly high levels of profits being made by the war.
Speaking out against war and racism, she wrote urgently about the rise of Nazism, calling on world leaders to pay attention. She turned a light on America's own racial attitudes and histories.
It is curious in how many of its phases the Ku Klux Klan resembles the Nazi movement. Its propaganda, racial and religious intolerance, its lawless beatings and kidnappings, its fiery crosses, curiously familiar, the belief in a caste of color to be upheld at all costs, the economic jealousy of Negro competition, the social and cultural exclusion, the abuses of convict camps, the mob-mindedness of our direct responsibility, even our attitudes toward our Jewish fellow countrymen, we are open to bitter reproach.
In 1935, on May the 3rd, Jane attended her last WILPF Congress, and she visited the White House, spending time with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. At the gala held in her honor, after listening to much praise, Jane said,
"You have pointed out how strong my convictions have been on this and that. Well, let me tell you that I have never been sure I was dead right. The rightness came after I'd get in so far and I couldn't back up. It had to be right."
An exhausted Jane gladly returned to Chicago, staying at the house of her oldest supporter, Louis de Koven Bowen. On May 10th, she returned to her beloved Hull House for a dinner, the last time she would be there. Experiencing severe abdominal pain a few days later, she went into hospital for exploratory surgery. Upon waking, she was informed she had inoperable intestinal cancer. When given the dire news, she joked,
"Well, at last I'll have a little time to read casually."
constantly surrounded by friends and family until the end. Jane slipped into a coma on May the 20th. On May the 21st, 1935, at the age of 74, Jane died in Chicago. The Episcopal Bishop of Washington had invited her interment to be beside Woodrow Wilson in the National Cathedral, but by her own wishes, that was respectfully declined. Her wish was to be buried in the family grave in Cedarvulle. As you know, her gravestone reads simply, "Jane Addams of Hull House and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom." Such a small woman, such a tremendous force. Thank you. Well, we hope you have found our show tonight informative. And if you have any questions about anything, or if you'd like to ask Susan B. anything, or Miss Jane Addams, please, you can just raise your hand, and if you have any questions, go right ahead. If not, there is refreshments.
Yes.
Was that, yes?
I was wondering, Susan, how were you able to collect 10,000, 100,000, 400,000 signatures in those days?
Knocking on doors, going to saloons, speaking, but collecting petitions was going door to door. So many, many doors. And I think I was perhaps pretty persuasive. I think many of them signed to get me off their doorstep.
Any other questions?
At Cedarvulle EC Church, they had a missionary in Mexico. She ended up starting about 10 churches. A lot of building had to go on. Took a lot of funds. She developed a relationship with the wives of executives of American companies in Mexico, and was able to cover a lot of funds in that direction. So did Jane Addams do the same thing because of Hull House and all the buildings and all the programs she was in? She needed funds.
Right, and she had some very, some good backers, some people, there was money behind some of the people that she approached, and so she got some good contributions from people. Yeah, she had to have had, because they had like 10 buildings initially.
She was always complaining that she spent most of her life fundraising. All of her speeches were usually paid when she was invited to talk anywhere, and she always gave to Hull House.
And, yeah,
But she did. She had a lot of rich women friends.
Right, and what she made, she contributed. I don't think she took anything of her own.
No.
Susan B. Anthony couldn't pay her, she refused to pay her fine for voting, but she said at the time, it'd be hard for me to pay, I'm $10,000 in debt. So she too had to get backers. There were a lot of, finally, as the suffrage movement went on, there were a lot of wealthy contributors to that also. Not to Susan B. particularly, but to the cause.
There's a wonderful children's book on Jane Addams, and it talked about how everything that she was given, she would give away. Finally, her friends gave her a pair of drawers, some long underwear, and they actually had her initials embroidered on it, so she couldn't get rid of those. But she did give those away, too.
And I want to add one thing. People usually ask me about Susan B. Anthony and marriage. And Susan B. Anthony, when she was teaching school, she quit dressing as a Quaker and and she loved clothing, by the way. She had a purple velvet dress. She had it made for her when she visited the Queen of England, Victoria. And anyway, she was courted by many men, but she said, let's see if I can remember this right. She said, in the present time, women, married women are either drudges, waiting hand and foot on men, or they are queens on a pedestal, dolls on a pedestal. I don't find myself either of those things, and so I have chosen not to marry. So she did have some chances early on.
And you did always wear your red shawl and your alligator purse.
I did. You know, yes, I carried an alligator purse. I believe the purse was very important for women. They needed to have a big purse because they needed to keep their own money, which was not done. And the old rhyme, come on.
Wasn't it about the baby, the bathwater, the baby?
Yeah, the baby in the water. What is it? It's an old jump rope rhyme.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
That's
Yeah,
right.
no, it's, somebody had a baby, she named him baby,
Yeah, and
she named him baby somebody.
yeah.
Oh, anyway, that nursery rhyme, it'll come to me in the middle of the night and you won't be there. It was, the end of it says, something said the doctor,
Yeah,
something said the nurse, vote said the lady with the alligator purse, which was the end of that rhyme, and I can't remember the beginning, so there you go. It'll come to me.
Did she have any relationship or closeness to Weaver? Weaver, one of the family children of John Addams?
I don't know.
No, in my research, George was her best friend, and it seemed like her and George were very, very tight until they were like 16. Otherwise, I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah.
I know obviously her brother was the surgeon that fixed her back, and
My
but
brother.
I haven't. Yes, I
My
haven't heard.
brother-in-law.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't come across that in my research. Sorry.
She might have married George if he was a little more open-minded, but she didn't want to have a conflict with him about what she believed to be, truly her aim in life.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your interest, and we do hope you've enjoyed your show. Hopefully, we'll see you again. Please join us for refreshments, and of course, if you have anything to ask Jane Addams or Susan B., or you want to take your photo, please do. Thank you so much.
George and Weaver had something in common.
Okay, so that was wonderful. It was the Women of Courage and Commitment. Jane Addams, played by Deb Pausz again. Cathy Elsbree played Susan B. Anthony, and Lee Adami as the moderator. So, and I was talking to Miss Lee earlier and inviting her back here, and it sounds like they would be very open to that. So hopefully we see them in the near future when we're together again doing other characters. So thank you so much.
boots still from my surgery.
I've still got my boots, thanks.